Prairie Yard and Garden is a production of the University of Minnesota Morris in cooperation with Pioneer Public Television. Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yakel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs.
This past spring, after church services, I was visiting with Larry, a farmer friend. We were comparing notes on the most recent rains and cold weather because I couldn't get into the garden and he couldn't plant his crops either. Then he asked if I had heard of the Soil Your Undies test to check the health of your soil. Later he sent me a link so I could check it out and try it too. Stay tuned because today's guest and I are going to compare our soiled undies. If you like to garden, I really recommend you attend the Come Grow With Us seminars held each month at the West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris. This past winter, they had a program on soil health. I thought, is soil health really that important? You just plant things and they grow. Well, Joe Storleen was the instructor, and it wasn't long before I was saying, gee, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And would you do a show with me, Joe? And he agreed, so here we are. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of Prairie Yard and Garden and have watched it since I was a young kid.
How did you get interested in soil and in being a soil scientist?
Yeah, soil science is not necessarily the most glamorous field to go into, but I've always been interested in gardening and soils to some degree. And as a student in environmental studies, I found that a lot of environmental problems were rooted in soil science. And so soils have a really important part in the Earth's landscape and providing the life to everything we see above ground. And so soils are so important. The more I learned, the more I became interested. And eventually I went on to do a PhD in soil science at Texas A&M University. And then following that, in a short postdoc, I arrived back here at St. John's University, back in my home state of Minnesota. And I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies here at St. John's University.
Now tell us, what is soil?
It's a great question. So from a plant perspective, I think a good definition for soil would be a dynamic natural body composed of both mineral and organic components and living forms in which plants grow.
Okay, what makes up our soil, and what are the approximate percentages of things that are in our soil?
Sure, so soils are pretty easy to think about as terms of, if you could think of a pie chart per se, because really half of soil, 50%, is actual mass or material, and the other half is actually just void space. So in that mass fraction, about 45%, the biggest fraction, is actually the mineral components of soil. Now these are rocks and stones that have weathered down over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years into smaller and smaller particles that give way to the sand, silts, and clays we see today in our soil. So that's about 45% of what soil is. The other 5%, give or take, is what we call organic matter, or the organic fraction. Now that can be a number of things, whether it's living forms themselves, or dead, decomposing things, animal residues, waste products, insects, things like that make up that organic fraction. And depending on the soil, that tends to be about 5%. So again, there we're up to about 50% is kind of mass, or solid material in soil. And then I mentioned the other 50% is simply void space. So that void space, depending on the moisture content of your soil, is maybe 25% air and 25% water.
What do you mean by soil health?
So soil health is a great, kind of a newer buzzword, and a lot of people are interested in soil health. And really, the USDA definition of soil health is the continued capacity of soil to act as a vital living ecosystem and function to sustain plant and animal and human function basically on the landscape.
What do you mean by visible life and invisible life in the soil?
Yeah, so visible life would be the things we commonly think of in the soil as things we see with our eyes. The first animal I think people think about, or critter people think about when they think of soil, is worms. So worms are part of the visible life, that's true. And then we have ants and spiders and beetles and mites and all kinds of gophers and things like that. Those are all the visible components of soil. The invisible life are microscopic creatures that make up this whole complex ecosystem within our soils. So these are things like bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, nematodes, protozoa, algae, the list goes on. But these are really tremendous amounts of life that make up in our soil, or the life that can be found in our soil.
Now, why is soil health so important to us?
So soil health is important to us as gardeners and landscape managers and people that just care about our properties and our landscapes, because soils provide that foundation of life, of all the things we see and all the plants we're growing on our landscape. Really boils down to the health of your soil and how your soil is doing. If we want a successful garden, a successful landscape environment, we've got to have a healthy, rich soil environment for those plants to grow in, all that vegetation and life to grow up through.
How do we know how healthy our soil is?
Yeah, soil health is categorized in a number of ways, but I think one of the first steps anybody can do as a homeowner or a gardener is to have a soil test done. That's probably step number one. When you take a soil test, we're going to go out and visualize your location first of all. So you want to think about whether you're going to be sampling a garden space, is this going to be your lawn or a flower bed? Because when you take a soil sample, you want that sample to be representative of that given type of plant location. Different plants call for different soils and different recommendations of the soil. So we want to identify a soil sample for maybe, let's say, a garden bed in particular. So when you go out to that garden bed, if you've got, some people have very large gardens, you might actually want to think about maybe sending in 2 or 3 samples, maybe from one end to the other, maybe a north, a south, and a middle part. For a very large garden, but many of us who have just smaller gardens and we want to get a baseline of what our soil's information is we just need to visualize an area and kind of look for different random locations, because what we're going to do is we're going to dig several small samples to put into maybe one bucket or something to mix together to represent the whole. Soils end up being very diverse, so we want to capture that diversity in a soil sample by not just taking one sample and sending that in, but actually several small samples, mixing them together, and then sending that sample in as a whole.
Joe, how do you collect a soil sample? Can you use a trowel, or is there a special tool?
Yeah, there's many ways to collect a soil sample. You could use a soil probe like this. Many farmers and crop consultants and even local extension offices oftentimes will have a soil probe like this. This is a really slick device, but you don't necessarily need it. But if you are going out to take a sample, this device here has a nice handle to grab onto. It has a nice place to put your foot to help it drive down into the soil to apply some pressure. And then when you take that sample, you often want to go over 6 inches. So I recommend folks try to go at least 8 inches actually, even though we don't need all that soil in the sample. But we're trying to look at the top 6 inches of soil, which is really important for our soil sample. And then I would look at the top layer, and if there's a lot of plant debris and up at the top, it might remove a little bit of that. But wherever that plant debris starts becoming unrecognizable, that's part of the soil. So we need to include that in our sample itself. And so then oftentimes we'll have a ruler or a measuring device out, and we'll measure down 6 inches into that sample, and I'll push that top 6-inch piece off into our bucket that we're mixing in, or container, a Tupperware container, what have you, and then we can discard the rest. That's commonly done with a soil probe. And again, we're going to take multiple samples, maybe 3, 4, 5 samples, depending on how large your area is, to represent one composite sample to send into the lab.
So you don't have to keep it solid. You don't have to worry that everything stays solid.
No, we actually want to mix it up. So once it's in that bucket, it comes out as a little core, but we actually can mix that up because we're going to mix all that sample together so that we get the average soil components or the soil nutrients in that one sample. Another nice device, if a lot of people maybe don't have a soil coring device, so you could take similarly a garden trowel or just a simple garden knife such as this. I find these devices also work really well to take a soil sample. Doesn't need to be fancy. The biggest thing is you don't need to take very large samples. You just need to take really maybe a square inch or two in the soil. And I try to tell people to drive this device, whether it's a trowel or the knife, kind of straight up and down in the soil. If you go at an angle, you're going to be diluting that bottom layer a bit because you've got a big fat area on the top and a skinny little area on the bottom, which can be done sometimes. So I try to tell people to be cautious and go in straight. And again, cut out your little square inch or 2 square inch hole, core to take out, extract from the soil. Again, dust off some of maybe the loose plant debris at the top, but the rest of it goes in your bucket to be mixed up for the sample that you're going to send off for analysis. There's a number of places you can send your soil sample, but most commonly here in Minnesota we have the University of Minnesota Soil Testing Lab down in St. Paul, where folks can figure out, you can go online, download a sheet to fill out that goes along with your soil sample. It actually gives you instructions on how to complete your soil sample, and then it gives you the address that you would make out to basically send that package off back to them for analysis.
So when they analyze it and send it back to you, what does that mean, or what does it tell you?
Sure. So on a soil sample, you're going to get a few very important things. You're going to get some information on your soil texture, first of all. And while that might not give you very specific things like a loam, a sandy clay loam, or a clay loam type thing, they do give you basically 3 categories, whether you have a fine soil, a medium soil, or a coarse soil. And that has to do with the amount of sand, silt, and clay in the sample. So a coarse soil is going to be something that has a higher sand content in it. It's a little bit grittier to the feel. Now, a fine soil, if your analysis come back and says a fine soil on it, that means you probably have a little bit higher clay content and silt content. And if you get a medium, that's a pretty nice soil. That's a texture that's closer to that loam, where we get a little bit of sand, silt, and clay all in one, which is a really good soil texture to work with.
Do they also talk about pH?
Yes, that's probably the most important chemistry aspect about your soil you should know as any gardener or homeowner, is what is the pH of your soil. That is very important, because if pH is off balance or we have problems with pH, we can have a number of large problems with other nutrients in the profile. So ideally on a pH of a soil, we're looking for about 6.5 or just slightly acidic. So remember, on the pH scale, it's a measure of acidity. So it's literally measuring H+ or hydrogen ions in solution. So if you know 7 is a neutral pH, going up to 8, 9, that's becoming more basic. And if you go below that, 6s and 5s, that's more acidic. So really, for most plants in our landscape, we want a soil pH of about 6.5.
Does it tell how much nitrogen is in your soil or what the nutrient content is?
Mm-hmm. So while it doesn't tell nitrogen on the basic sample analysis, nitrogen is one of our trickiest elements to measure in soil, which is why it's a little bit unpredictable, so they don't generally give that in a general soil test. We do get very important information on phosphorus and potassium. And so they'll show you the numbers, the actual concentrations of phosphorus and potassium in your soil, but more importantly, they even give you a scale on the sheet to show you whether you are high or low in those given nutrients, which then will direct you into the type of maybe fertilizer that you would want to apply. So they also give you analysis of the amount of fertilizer based on your soil test and what you are growing in the landscape. What you have checked off on your soil sample sheet is what you're trying to grow. They will give you recommendations for the amount of fertilizer you should be adding to your landscape, generally in a per 1,000 square foot area.
So when they give you these recommendations, is it like they suggest you add phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen too?
One of the most important things a basic soil test will give you is the amount of organic matter in your soil. Organic matter is really important because it does a number of things for our soil and soil health. One of the things we know about organic matter is that it is a source of nutrients and food for those microbes and life within the soil, which translate to more food for your plants in your landscape. It also does a number of things like hold on to water better, improve water retention, increase nutrient retention, improve aeration, reduce compaction. This is why I like to call organic matter the superhero of soils.
Okay.
So it's very important to know where your organic matter content is in soils, and a basic soil test will give you that information. Ideally, we like to shoot around, for organic matter content of around 5% is really good. Now, if this soil has been cultivated a long time, maybe lost some soil health or lost some of the organic matter, we do see soils in Minnesota that are getting down into maybe the 2 or 3%. But again, I've seen soils as high as 10 and 11% organic matter, and they're still functioning very healthy. That's a very healthy, rich soil.
How do we increase the organic matter in our soils?
Yeah, so organic matters, if you want to go about increasing that organic matter, there's a number of options you have as a gardener or a landscape manager as far as to increase organic matter. You could start off first of all with very simple things like adding compost to your soil periodically. Compost is a great source of organic matter and nutrients for those plants. As they break down, they feed the microbes in the soil, and then in return they're feeding those plants actively as well. Another common source of organic matter across Minnesota is animal manures. So you could use things like composted cattle manure, composted poultry litter. Different animal manures tend to be a good source of organic matter as well, and are commonly found in our Minnesota or upper Midwest landscapes. Other sources of organic matter, just about anything that is dead decomposing organic mulches. So you could think about straws or rice hulls or different seed meals, bone meal, feather meal. There's a number of different organic compost and soil amendments out there that are great sources of organic matter. And then finally, if you have a big enough garden and are interested in some newer trends with adding organic matter, you might consider trying a cover crop. If you've got an adequate window of setting aside some of your garden space to put in a cover crop. Now, a cover crop is something where you're not going to be harvesting that crop to eat it necessarily or use it in some way, but what we do is we plant that cover crop just to feed into the soil and build organic matter and maybe suppress weeds as well. So there's a number of benefits with going with cover crops as well, and that's a great source of organic matter.
Is there a difference in the organic matter as to how many or how much nutrients it releases to the microbes, and in what kind of a time frame?
Yeah, so when you think about the different nutrients coming from this organic matter, it boils down to a lot of times the most important aspect is the nitrogen content. So in soil science and agronomy, we like to talk about the C to N ratio, what stands for the carbon to nitrogen ratio of different mulches, compost, and plant material. So the lower the C to N ratio, the more nitrogen they have to the ratio of carbons, the faster that material decomposes in the soil and will release those nutrients to the plants. So examples of things like sawdust or wood chips have very high C to N ratios, and while they're good for a mulch on the soil surface, they decompose very slowly in the soil, so they don't release nutrients very quickly over time. Versus something like your compost, a garden compost, maybe a mushroom compost or soybean meals or things like that that are higher in nitrogen, those break down very quickly in the soil and can release those nutrients to the plants in a very quick time.
Sometimes if we use some of the things that are slower to decompose, does that tie up the nitrogen? I've heard that sometimes you need to fertilize so that your garden produce has enough nitrogen until the microbes in the soil can break down some of the things that you're using as a mulch.
Yeah, so if you're using a mulch that's high in carbon, you might want to think about supplementing with some sort of nitrogen to offset that, because yes, what happens is the microbes will actually kind of steal the nitrogen in the soil environment, and it won't be available for the plants for uptake. That's what happens when you mix in maybe a high carbon to nitrogen ratio product or a mulch that's kind of low in nitrogen, is it'll bind up that nitrogen, the microbes will bind up the nitrogen, and then it won't be available to your plants, so your plants suffer. So if you want to ameliorate that, you want to think about adding a source of nitrogen to kind of offset that binding mechanism. That could happen.
Now, you mentioned mixing. Is tilling good for the soil or not good for the soil?
Well, there's different reasons we till. Some people till, probably the number one thing is to promote aeration. But there's a lot of research out there that shows we maybe need to do a little bit less tilling in our landscapes, and especially in some situations. I found in a lot of the loamy to sandier soils especially, we probably don't need to till as much as the average gardener does. So I would say the average gardener maybe tills once a season, which is fine. But then some of us are tilling a few more times maybe to get rid of weeds or at the end of the season as well. And this is what we like to joke around as maybe recreational tillage. There isn't really a need for that. So some of us have even tried to avoid tillage overall. For example, in my garden bed, I have more of a sandy loam soil. I don't find a lot of compaction with a heavy clay. I'm able to actually go no-till with my garden, and there's a number of benefits you can get by not tilling. Tilling does a number of things when you do till. Besides aeration, what it's doing is giving those microbes lots of oxygen, and then they can break down the organic matter, remember the superhero of your soil, very quickly. And they do so kind of in a flush of activity, which it seems good for a little while, but they kind of crash back down to earth over time. And what actually happens over many, many years of tillage is we actually start losing organic matter content in our soil. Remember, organic matter is very important in the soil. We don't want to lose organic matter, so we want to be conscious of how much we till, and if we can reduce tillage at all, it's a good thing. One of the other aspects of tillage that's really important is it breaks up aggregates in soil. So this is a soil aggregate. You can see it's just what you think of as a little clump of soil, and what it's made of is maybe mostly silt and clay particles that are kind of glued together, and the microbes themselves actually create these glues in the soil that stick these particles together, and they form bigger and bigger particles, and then you have things like fungal hyphae that kind of act like a net around these clumps of soil, and they get bigger and bigger. And when you come along and you till the soil, what happens is you bust up these aggregates and you get a finer material. It's nice to have big clumpy aggregates in your soil because the next time it rains, we want that rainwater to get into our soil environment. And these big aggregates allow water to infiltrate much, much better into our soils. They also allow infiltration of air and the gases we mentioned that are important in the root zone, and they actually help us resist compaction over time by having aggregates in your soil. So there's a number of really important aspects that aggregates play in your soil and soil health. So excessive tillage breaks these up and creates finer and finer particles, which again can maybe sometimes cause a crust you see once in a while at the soil surface. If it doesn't have very many aggregates, your soil might tend to crust a little bit.
What are mulches and what are their effects?
Yeah, so mulching the soil is really important for soil health because we want to try to regulate temperatures at the soil surface. We like to suppress weeds. We like to reduce evaporation, so mulches play a really important role on your soil landscape. So there's different mulches you could use. A lot of folks use things like straw. Straw mulches are very popular. You can use shredded leaves, or if you rot it for a year, it becomes a product we like to call leaf mold. It's very popular in some horticultural industries. Wood chips are very popular on the landscape and a good mulch that you could use to cover your soil. Even things like mushroom compost, even corn stalks. If you're in the upper Midwest, we grow lots of corn, and some people even use corn stalks, and that's a fine product to put down to cover your soil in some situations. So whatever you have organics on the landscape, you can kind of look around. Maybe it's lawn clippings are another thing that if you don't have sprays and things, in some situations, even fresh lawn clippings are a good source of mulch as well.
That's what I use too. Have you heard of the program called Soil Your Undies to check for soil health?
Yes, I have. So the Soil Your Undies test is a very interesting and pretty entertaining test you can do to measure the microbial activity and kind of get an estimate of soil health in your garden or landscape.
Have you done it?
Yes, I have. I actually teach it in my classes as a lab component, but I've also done it personally in my home gardens as well to measure soil health and compare different garden situations.
Could we see the results or find out how you do it?
Absolutely. We can go take a look.
I have a question. How many grapevines does it take to make an adequate amount of wine?
That's an awesome question. We get that all the time. Today we're in the Horticultural Research Center here at the Arboretum, and we're standing in front of a grapevine. And when we answer this question, we kind of think, well, every vine can produce about 2 or 3 bottles. So here's a bottle of wine, here's a bottle of wine, here's another bottle of wine. So if you want to grow grapes in your home yard, you want to look for a place that's in the full sun so you can capture as much sunlight as possible. And then the grapes actually perform the best. They don't get as many diseases. And if you want to produce a case of wine, you want to plant about 10 vines so that you can have enough fruit to produce that much wine.
Ask the Arboretum Experts has been brought to you by the Minnesota Landscape Arboretum in Chanhassen, dedicated to enriching lives through the appreciation and knowledge of plants.
Okay, Mary, so here we are at the St. Ben's Campus Community Garden, and this is a plot we maintain throughout the year for a demonstration purposes in some of the classes that I teach. And in this plot right here, we've planted it to a crimson clover cover crop. So again, this is just building soil health, building nitrogen, suppressing weeds. And in this plot, we have a little sign up that says, do not disturb undies in hibernation. So yes, we have done the Soil Your Undies test in this plot. And so we started this approximately 6 weeks ago. We have one pair of women's briefs, 100% cotton, unbleached. Same thing, men's briefs here that were dug approximately 6 inches into the soil. And so now we're going to unearth these undies and have a look at them and see how much decomposition has occurred over that time. Already I can see there's not much to unearth here.
So this is a measure of your soil health. It's something simple that anybody can try.
That's correct, yep. So this is giving us an indication of how fast microbes are degrading cotton in our soil, which is going to be a proxy for microbial activity. So with this soil right here, there was not much left for the women's briefs, unfortunately. A little bit more of elastic, but that's just some lining. So that's about it for the women's briefs. So this is a pretty healthy soil. And if I can find the men's, so a little bit less decomposition here, but still, wow, there's not a whole lot left. So Mary, if you'd hold up this one, and then I can show side by side. This is what those undies looked like 6 weeks ago, and they're just falling apart.
Well, I tried this at home because my friend told me about it, and so this is all that's left of mine too. So,
well, we compare, it looks like we've got some pretty healthy soil here. We've got a lot of microbial life actively decomposing our undies in the soil, so that's a good sign that we've got a very healthy soil environment.
Okay, Joe, what are the final things that you would recommend for anybody with their soil health?
Sure, so a few final thoughts on soil health and keep thinking about your taking care of your soil would be, first of all, everybody should have a soil test done if you haven't done so in a while, so you know what the status of your soil is and you can understand a little more on how to manage it. The other one is to try to keep a mulch down, cover the soil. I like to say don't garden naked. We like to cover a mulch down on the soil. Keep it covered throughout the growing season, has a lot of benefits for us. And then finally, think about actively feeding your soil, because that's what's going to feed your plants throughout the rest of your growing season.
Thank you so much for all of the great information.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Funding for Prairie Yard and Garden is provided in part by Heartland Motor Company, providing service for over 30 years in the heart of truck country. Heartland Motor Company, we have your best interest at heart. Farmers Mutual Telephone Company and Federated Telephone Cooperative, proud to be powering ASERA. Mark and Margaret Yakel Julien, in honor of Shalom Hill Farm, a nonprofit rural education retreat center in a beautiful prairie setting near Windham in southwestern Minnesota. Shalom Hill Farm, shalomhill.org. Diamond Willow Advanced Care Assisted Living, providing custom homes with smaller settings designed especially for high care needs.